honor to introduce our featured guest speaker. Please join me in welcoming Professor Maria Bucur-Deckard, Professor John Hill Professor at the University of Indiana. It's my pleasure to introduce her. She's the author and co-author of 11 books and numerous articles in many journals, from the American Historical Review to the Journal of Women's History. Her most recent work includes The Nation's Gratitude, War and Citizenship in Romania After World War I, published in 22, and The Vanishing Invalid, Visual Representations of Disabled Veterans in Interwar Romania, published in 2023. And she's currently completing a book manuscript entitled 5 Phases of Disability in Interwar Romania. Please join me in welcoming Professor Maria Bucur-Deckard.
Thank you so much. I was asked to talk about what's happening in Romania today and not about my own research. So if people have questions about disability history.
As a historian, you can best put our attention, our efforts in historic context.
I'll try to do a little bit of that, but we'll see. And I want to say hello to Dorian Brana. I haven't seen you, gosh, since COVID 2020, also on Zoom. So nice to see you again. I'm glad that you're doing well. I have a PowerPoint. I'd like to share that if possible. Let me just see if I can do it. And is it now shared?
Yes.
Yes?
Started. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so we're in presentation mode. Let me see if I can. Oh, it's doing its thing. Hold on. Apparently it takes a minute to. Here we go. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you to Theodor Stan for entrusting me with opening statements for this gathering. Since the election in the US in early November, I've been thinking a great deal about the political crossroads where the world is currently situated. After the presidential elections in Romania, the specter of fascism has become more present, and I was asked to provide some reflections on what this might portend for the Romanian diaspora and Romania's future. So I want to start with a clear statement about what I see as the challenge of the moment. The frustration and resentment which have fueled the vote for the presidential and parliamentary elections in Romania these past few weeks are not only about facts such as corruption, inflation, economic polarization, but also about perception. The lens that citizens of Romania have adopted to exercise their power as voters are, in my opinion, connected much more to a longing for something that is not possible in the moment, even as they are reacting to factual reality. It's a form of flight and connected to expectations that ignore the limits of the possible. There are real signs of disparity between the EU averages and important measurements of well-being and Romanian stat. I don't know how well you can see this. I can share the PowerPoint afterwards also if people want to click on these things. I will use 2 sets, one internal featured here and a comparative EU one to illustrate my point. These are very recent stats. So salaries have grown substantially since Romania's entry into the EU. So has the GDP. While the absolute number of college graduates has gone down recently, it generally correlates with a decrease in fertility you can see on the right side of the screen. And it also shows an overall upward trend. Romania's poverty rate is 13% higher than the EU average, but the unemployment rate is lower. Disparities by gender around unemployment have also become negligible, as you can see towards the end of this graph with the blue as men and pink as women. Youth unemployment is higher by 7% than the EU average, but the gross debt half as high as the EU average. Inflation is higher by 3%, but the wage-gender gap is 8% lower. So it is for sure a mixed bag, and not a clear picture of either lagging behind the EU average or somehow not doing well overall. But the disparity in the GDP per capita, where Romania is at 1/3 of the EU average, is a big part of the frustration expressed by those who aspire to more or work in the West. I will not dwell much on how politicians have framed their message and how that message relates to the social and economic reality. As we know, right now there's a meeting between the likely coalition, which apparently doesn't include USR anymore. And so things are so dynamic, there's nothing that I can possibly guess without looking at the news constantly. So we see the incoming PSD, PNL, UDMR coalition that has been in power for the entire post-communist period trying to pick at the pieces of their own making by reasserting control, even in the face of criticism of the rule and corruption of state institutions. We see USR fighting with itself about the best way to participate in the process. Elena Lasconi calls out the lack of consideration of these 3 parties for the budgetary crisis that is coming very soon, even as another USR member, Nicu Jordan, is entering the presidential race without endorsement from USR. It's very confusing. On the 18th of December, USR published these conditions for joining the coalition. There are clearly internal struggles in all of these parties, and what will prevail is not something I or anyone else can predict. I'll add to that I just read that Trump is now going to request, as incoming president of the United States, that all the NATO members increase their contribution of their percentage of the GDP to maintain good relations with the US. And so in the current budgetary crisis, this has put a huge thumb on the scale as well. So who knows, basically. It is clear that the criticism that the establishment received in the form of voters' lack of support is not completely getting through to these politicians. I will simply say there is nothing out of the ordinary here. These parties are doing what other parties are doing elsewhere in Europe and the United States. But I'm more interested in understanding how people engage with these political processes as voters. The differences in how people have voted says something about generational change, about rural-urban splits, and about how the Romanian diaspora has changed in the past 35 years. I'm sorry, this is somebody else's phone. I have to turn it off here. Okay, oops. All right. The spectacular change in Romania over the past 35 years has to be marked, even as we find ourselves confused in this moment. Starting in 2025, Romania will be just another county in the country of the EU, as a friend of mine used to say, as far as movement across state borders is concerned. With full admission into Schengen, Romanian citizens become overnight holders of a golden ticket. Just gonna have to close it now and turn it off. Hold on just a second.
I'm
yes,
sorry.
your phone.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
This is what happens when you're visiting friends while you're giving papers. Okay, moving on. So with full admission, you have full mobility. Romanian citizens become overnight holders of a golden ticket for mobility and employment, educational and entertainment opportunities. Opportunities to access all sorts of goals and destinations multiply. But we also know that on the receiving end of these trajectories are societies experiencing their own anxieties about migration. And that can be seen in the ways the Romanian diaspora has voted in the presidentials, largely with ultranationalist parties of fascist sympathies. What gives? A friend pointed out to me recently that this is about failed expectations, about the resentment of people who thought they were going to the land of milk and honey to find communities that were in fact much more closed than open to the arrival of the Romanian migrants. From my own experience of being a migrant for more than 40 years, I see nothing exceptional about this. As first-generation migrants, people like me live between and in at least two worlds, that of the past and that of the present, whose contours and rules may seem quite different from each other, missing that home, Acasa, of childhood and safety, the flavors that cannot be recaptured in a different environment, feeling unseen, and having to explain yourself all the time, having your name mispronounced, being asked after 40 years, where are you from, are all very familiar experiences to me. I imagine most of you and others living in Spain, France, and the US have lived with this condition of marginality, invisibility, and frustration. It is the other side of the coin, named mobility. There is also the specific experience of communism that people of my generation and older had a formative context in. Even as younger generations of people explore the possibilities of Marxism as an alternative to neoliberal capitalism, trauma and this experiential knowledge that we had with communism push us away from considering any leftist alternative to the present. All of this explains the kind of search for something else, but why fascism? We need to first acknowledge how young democratic processes and the practice of democracy are in fact in Romania. The first free elections in which all citizens voted with equal rights was 1990. Democracy is still an adolescent in Romania. With so many people who vote in the elections living either overseas or with long-term experience in other countries, how people understanding the democratic political process and their own voting rights has also become more complex over the last 35 years. Political education has become haphazard. Years ago, civic education became a subject in Romanian schools in an attempt to generalize expectations about good governance, as well as asserting citizenship rights. But today, it is mostly in an individuated way that people become familiar with political institutions and platforms. There is less of a sense of common good being translated into responsible political behavior than a fragmented and very much divided marketplace of ideas and perspectives, or personal bubbles that seldom practice transparency and consistencies between speech and deed. And as high school teachers in Romania have recently stated, history education in Romania is still done according to textbooks that ignore the enormous contributions of historians of the interwar and World War II. The textbooks approved by the Ministry of Education are frankly unacceptable to anyone who is serious about understanding Romania's past, on many accounts. But focusing strictly on fascism and World War II, the importance of radical right-wing ideas, the racism that permeated a great deal of public discourse and policymaking in the interwar period, the violent anti-Semitism of the Romanian army and gendarmes while operating on the Eastern Front alongside Nazi Germany, the continued negation of anti-Roma racist policies at the time, all of these facts are still contested by negationists and minimizers who consider Antonescu as someone to be admired and as a patriot. A lot of it has to do with thinking about anti-communism as patriotism. But our understanding, regardless of the trauma of living under Romania's state socialism, needs to evolve towards a more nuanced and accurate comprehension of the enormous structural violence that Romanian citizens and the Romanian government engaged in during the 1930s and 1940s before the arrival of the Soviet troops on Romanian soil. Within this growing fragmentation, the center, understanding the importance of both democratic methods and democracy as a goal, even when it doesn't deliver on my own desires and aspirations, has become marginalized. Why? We live in a world in which instant gratification and conspicuous consumption pass for well-being. It is addictive, and one has to make an active, conscious choice to put space between oneself and these mirages. I see the current rise of fascistic rhetoric as both a response to these forces of fragmentation and enormous pressure to conform in particular ways to these consumer aspirations. It is also a type of misplaced nostalgia for a past profoundly misunderstood by many people. The interwar period continues to be held up as a golden age of Romanian culture and society on many platforms, despite thousands of historical works that document a reality of failed promises, exclusionary politics and practices, racist scientific research, and overall a very mixed record. What is there to celebrate about the interwar? The literary mastery of people like Mircea Eliade, who later joins the Antonescu regime and sings the praises of fascism in Portugal as he's serving the Romanian fascist regime. The disciplining achievement of the legionary movement that called for the exclusion of the so-called foreigners from the political body, even as Romanian society has never acknowledged the fact that the wealth in modern Romanian families is built on 550 years of enslavement by Romanian Orthodox Church and boyars of the Rome. What the interwar period stands for me, as a historian of this period, is an incessant attempt at fashioning unity out of diversity. It failed, because the state cannot function by putting down or outright excluding the 30% of the population who didn't fit the orthodoxist ethno-exclusionary version of patriotic citizen that both state and many intellectuals and academic leaders held as their goal. It failed then, despite support from the Nazis. The lessons of the interwar period are not about the possibility of that homogenizing vision becoming better articulated or more successful today. And that is because Romania is a small country at the edge of Europe, a country whose own existence and safety depends on alliances with stronger state players and things like NATO. And even as I speak here, as the daughter of a Russian mother and a Romanian father, I know that depending on Russian interest has never done much for Romania and for the stability and well-being of people living there. I wanted to put out here a couple of images of books that have been done on the interwar period. I should say that all the books that I'm showing here, even though some of them are in English, are actually available in Romanian for everybody. They're all translated. Lionizing patriots and heroes of whatever kind, looking for charismatic leaders, has been a trend in Romanian politics and society for a long time. Since 1990, that obsession found outlets in sports and entertainment or culture, and in all the spectacular science Olympiad results some students in Romania have achieved. But none of those heights say much about either the system of education or about the overall abilities of Romanian society. The ability to run elections in which democracy is upheld both in form and in substance is, however, something I believe will serve the country better than wishing from some savior to show up and sweep Romania into a non-existing Eden. And taking responsibility for the common good and not only one's own personal sense of discomfort, frustration, and resentment is what is needed at the moment. Fascism and exclusionary nationalism of the Christian, ethnically Romanian kind will not deliver Romania from the framework of global economic processes and international security questions. Living in a state and part of a larger framework that guarantees individual protections for all citizens, and where the rule of law is about basic principles of equality and rights and obligations, even as corruption has made great damage to the application of those principles, is a better outcome than giving up on those alliances and the framework that secures the aspirations of Romanian citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention and for your speech, and it reminded me actually of Doina Cornea and her speeches on consumerism at the beginning of the during the just prior to the Romanian Revolution, and warnings that we couldn't understand at the time and which are still relevant today. Thank you for putting this in context and for getting the discussion started. We appreciate your work and all that you bring and your support over the years during our fundraising campaign for the vulnerable people, for the refugees from Ukraine. We greatly appreciate your intervention today as well.